The first action item is the approval of our minutes of April 6, 2015. I'll move action item A. For a second? Any questions or comments about the minutes? Hearing none, all in favor? Aye. Any objections or abstentions? Great. So before addressing action item B, I'm going to move that we address information items A and B on our agenda in an executive session. We'll then return to the public session and address action item B, which is our spending policy. We will now go into executive session, please. Thank you.
So you got to tell them.
Resume action items with item B of the agenda, which is a deliberation on the NYPMIFA annual spending and a resolution to approve CUNY's spending policy. And I will move the approval of action item B.
Second?
Thank you. Discussion. Janet.
Okay. As a New York nonprofit, we fall under the New York Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. And as such, the fiduciaries of this committee must deliberate on the prudence of a proposed spending rate. We are proposing to maintain the spending rate from last year, which is a 4.5% spending rate. But by way of background, NYPMIFA mandates that the fiduciaries deliberate on the prudence of this 4.5% spending rate, and they do so on a by-fund basis, and they also take into consideration 8 prudence factors that are contained within NYPMIFA itself. Now, we have over 1,000 funds in the pool, so it would be onerous, to say the least, that to go and deliberate on each of these funds. So apparently the Attorney General did contemplate this and does permit a single decision to be made, provided that the funds are what they call, quote unquote, similarly situated in terms of purpose and the way they are invested. And that's the reason we classify each of our funds into one of 4 categories of similarly situated funds. And these are listed in the report. The 4 fund categories are academic support, institutional support, scholarships and fellowships, and instructions. And together, over 90% of the spending goes to these areas. And then the process proceeds to deliberate based upon the prudence factors, which is also shown on the next page. So they are duration and preservation of the endowment fund, purposes of the institution and endowment funds, general economic conditions, possible effects of inflation and deflation, expected total return from income and appreciation, other resources of the institution, alternatives to expenditure of the endowment, and the CUNY investment policy. As we've noted on the right-hand side, most of these factors are universal, and so they would affect all of these similarly situated funds in a like manner. But there are 2 exceptions. Factor number 2, which is purposes of the institution and endowment fund, is an exception because this is a factor which is specific to each fund category. And factor number 7, alternatives to expenditure of the endowment, really only applies in exigent situations where, for example, we're in a crisis. So with that information in mind, we'll begin the deliberations by going over the exception factors first and then the universal. So if you go 2 pages ahead, we'll start with deliberating on factor 2, which basically looks at CUNY and the funds within the endowment, in particular their purpose. So With scholarships and fellowships, they represent 68% of total spending. CUNY relies upon these funds to attract and retain the best students and staff, and also to provide access to educational opportunities that would not be there otherwise for students. So it's really a key part of the support that the endowment provides, and they are generally long-term funds that are designated by donors that, you cannot change the purpose. Academic support represents 17% of total spending. It's important to CUNY in the sense that we rely upon these funds for the professional and technical educational programs, things like library resources, educational equipment, and lab supplies would be part of programs that would rely upon the academic support spending. So it's a key part of the funding from the endowment, and again, they're long-term funds with where donors have designated their dollars for this purpose. Institutional support represents approximately 7% of total spending, and these funds go to support the work-study programs for those that aren't qualified for the federal work-study program. So, it's therefore a key component of support for the university, and again, long-term funds designated by donors. Instruction funds represent 2% of the funds, and we rely upon those for fellowships in addition to some of the dollars under scholarships and fellowships. But the other consideration that we look at is that historically the state appropriations have provided the majority of funds for these programs, with the pool not being drawn upon as the primary source. However, the spending rate needs to balance the current needs of the students as well as the future students and their needs, and the fact that these are donor-designated funds. Moving along to Factor 7, which applies to situations where we're in a crisis and additional funds may be needed. During the financial crisis, as we all know, we suffered a significant loss. Since then, our market value exceeds where it was prior to the financial crisis. However, the outlook going forward is for asset class returns to be below their long-term average, which argues for moderation in spending. And now I'm going to turn it over to Thomas to talk about the universal factors.
Yes. So the first one is duration and preservation of the endowment funds. As Janet pointed out, these are perpetual funds, and so it's important to find a spending rate that balances out, as Janet pointed out again, the needs of the current students versus the need of the future students. We know that spending, especially in a period where returns are low, can deplete these endowment funds, and so it's very important to maintain prudence in spending. We've seen lots of examples of colleges that have spent too much in low return environments, and the problem is you eat your seed corns, and you won't, even if with a market recovery, you won't necessarily recover to your previous peak. In previous discussions about the spending rate, we've been in a situation where we had quite strong annual returns, and so there was discussion of, does it really make sense to have a 4.5% spending rate when the fiscal year returns was way above that? We cautioned that the outlook in terms of valuations was potentially quite dire, and we're now seeing that come to fruition. So the talk about moderation obviously makes much more sense when you've had a period and look forward to another period where the fiscal year returns likely will be negative. In terms of the overall economic conditions, we're obviously looking at a low growth environment with very low interest rates, which all puts a downward pressure on the future returns. On top of that, valuations are currently still above average for most asset classes. It doesn't necessarily count for all asset classes, but for the majority of asset classes, and especially the ones that are the majority of the portfolio, we expect lower than average returns going forward for the next probably 3 to 5 years. And so that obviously puts some restraint on what we can do in terms of spending as well. The expected total return for the pool is still 5% over the long term. We still believe that that is a reasonable rate of return that's still embedded as the target. But again, we think that in the next intermediate term, we will probably be below that because of valuations, et cetera. Finally, in terms of other resources, as Jen pointed out, there aren't really any other resources that can stand in terms of for spending of the portfolio. So something is clearly mandated and something we need to do. So we're not suggesting to take it down below the 4.5%, but the 4.5% seems prudent in terms of future expected returns.
So I just want to summarize, that the proposed rate is 4.5%. And we feel that this balances a number of factors. First of all, the 4.5% meets the current needs of the participants. In fact, the actual spending rate since 2009 has been less than 4.5%. Last year, it was 2.4%. I have the numbers with me if you want to go over every year, but it's much less than the 4.5%. And we do, just as an FYI, send out multiple communications to colleges to encourage their use of pool dollars for appropriate spending, in addition to noting if they have had funds which have been quote-unquote inactive in terms of spending over the last 5 years, and encourage them to join in with us on repurposing programs to make better use of existing funds if they're outdated or antiquated or are just not even legal at this point. And we have conducted 2 pilot programs, and we're very successful in changing some of the funds for better use, or use rather. So it's a long process, but it's actually worth going through to get the increased dollars for student use. But we also feel that the 4.5% will help to sustain and preserve the corpus of the endowment, especially given the economic scenario that Thomas described, the lower expected returns, the fact that the pool is in a situation of net withdrawal, so we take in less than what we spend in contributions, just given the numerous entities and the fact that they have foundations and put most of that money into their foundations. And also that the trend has been with our peers to lower spending so that we don't really dig into the corpus of funds. It's unfortunate we do have some new funds that have come in this environment of the last year. And what we've had to do in certain situations is the donors have been willing to basically modify the agreement. And they've given additional funds, but it's been a tough situation. But the other factor that needs to be considered is that, you can have it's much easier to change from a conservative spending policy if we're overly pessimistic than the reverse. It's pretty harsh to take the cuts that would be needed if we had to reduce spending from a loftier level. So with that, we have a vote.
Well, are there questions or comments first? Yes.
2 questions. The first one is for the categorizing of the different things. You said they were similarly situated in terms of purpose. What is similarly situated?
The similarly situated is that the funds would fall under the purpose of academic support, institutional support, scholarships and fellowships, or instruction, and also they're all invested in the same commingled pool.
And that leads to my second question is, I saw scholarships and fellowships, so what types of scholarships and fellowships are included in the endowment fund?
You know, we have 1,000 funds, and, you know, 68% of the funds are for scholarships and fellowships, and they are all over the place in terms of, you know, by the different colleges, the intent of the donor, this is the very specific intent. Some are more restrictive in terms of, you know, just being allowed to spend the, let's say, 4.5%. It would have to be, for example, a doctoral student that's in his second year of school and has an A average in a certain course of study. That's how specific they can get.
Yeah, George, it's really, as Janet said, it's as much as you can think about it, it's all over the place in terms of, there are some donors that want to give money to a specific students who are in a program of study, so they may want their donation to go all towards nursing students. Could be that they want it to go to you know, certain students who are in need of additional financial aid. So it really varies. It's all over the place. There's thousands of these donations that are made by private donors, and but we're gratified that the overwhelming majority of the funds that are spent out of the pool go towards fellowships and scholarship.
So Matt, is there a website or a Google site that I could find out all, I mean, to his question, is there some place where I could go and find out all the scholarships that are available at the City University of New York?
We could get you an ID, Trustee Beal.
Oh, no, I don't mean me, but if a student, is there a website that a student can go to, or a prospective student can go to and find out all of the scholarships that are available at the City University?
We usually encourage the students to contact their local financial aid office at their campus, because many of the scholarships are campus specific, and most of the donors give to a CUNY campus and not necessarily to the university. There are some that are to the university, but most of them are to Lehman or Brooklyn or Hostos. And so we usually direct students to go to their financial aid office, and they can usually get what's available for their campus.
George?
So yeah, I think she was trying to lead me to the question I was trying to ask is, in terms of like public transparency, is there a way, like an online website where you know the specifics of all the spending, or is this not available?
We have a website for the investment pool where the participants in the pool have access, and in terms of the spending, after we get the approval of the spending rate from the board, we then calculate spending according to a formula using this 4.5% spending rate.
But
That
it's
is
not
then,
open to the public.
right.
It's not open to the public.
It's not open to the public, but it does show for each fund, the funds that are available broken down by endowed and non-endowed, and very specific by each fund, and what they can spend. And prior to NIPMFA, by the way, when we didn't have the by-fund spending, and the reason that NIPMFA includes this provision is so that there is no cross-subsidization of spending from one fund to another. And this does indeed happen if you don't have these limits on a by-fund basis. So you might have seen prior to NIPMFA, people that had run out of money on one fund, but they went to another fund to make up the difference. It can, I mean, it has its pluses and its minuses, but it overall is truer to the donor and what the donor intent is, and I strongly support that.
My only comment is that investment policy on the one hand and spending policy on the other really are connected.
Oh, yes,
Yes, they are very much connected.
yes.
And I don't think the presentation makes the connection effectively for us. I'm supportive of this because I know that the investment policy, we have in essence frozen. We know what that is, and we've lived with 4.5% before. But we know that our total return has not met 4.5%.
The actual spending versus the target rate.
Well, our investment, our return in our investment, you're not expecting 4.5% going forward, correct?
Over the longer term, yes, but under the shorter
Over
term.
the longer term, yes, for sure, but this is for this year. This is 4.5% for this year. What I'm suggesting is, and I'm in favor of this, but I want to tell you why, because we're not adjusting the investment policy. But I do think that we should have a presentation made to this committee to demonstrate to us and to frankly educate us about the interaction between the investment policy on the one hand and the spend policy on the other. Factor in something for inflation and factor in something for the increase in our budget. Those are all the moving pieces that fit into this 4.5% spend.
Right.
And I don't think we address it adequately, but nevertheless, I'm supportive of this resolution for the reasons I just said.
So if I may just quickly, so this is a pretty formulated way of doing this that NIPMIFA have sort of dictated. We have the other discussion when we have asset allocation discussions, among others, where we show what the expected return of different asset classes are. We compare that to historical returns, et cetera. So there's a deeper discussion at that level where spending comes into the picture.
I'm not quarreling as to what's required. I just think a greater explanation as to how we satisfy what's required would be helpful going forward, particularly when we change, if we do change our investment policy.
Yeah. We usually combine, the asset allocation
Yeah.
review with.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm surprised to hear that we're only spending at 2.5, and I don't want to discuss that tonight, but I find that in this day and age, when it's mostly used for scholarship, I would like to hear what the plan is to get up to 4%. And I'm surprised that it isn't, particularly given the demands of students for scholarship. So at another time, I'd love to hear what we're doing to get the word out that there's potential for additional scholarship out there.
Yeah, we've got multiple communications going out to advise people of their spending and lack thereof on a very regular basis.
And Trustee Bill, just go back to your previous question. There is a link on the CUNY website that students can use that's called Find Your Scholarship. So I will send the link to the Subcommittee on Investments so you can all take a look at it.
Yeah, I was just about to ask the same question, so I'd like you to.
Yeah. I'll email you all the link.
Okay.
So we have the resolution in front of us. It's been moved. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed, any abstentions? Resolution carries. Any other business for the committee? Meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, and sorry, Judah, sorry. Sorry, Valerie.